On the night of February 1st, 1993, a driver traveling down Highway 24 in Moxie, Washington, slammed on their brakes. It was too late. In the middle of the poorly lit road stood a man. He wasn't running. He wasn't waving for help. He was just there. The impact was instantaneous. The driver fled into the night, leaving behind a John Doe dressed in military camouflage and work boots. To the local police, he looked like a drifter, perhaps a soldier from the nearby Yakima Training Center who had wandered too far into the dark. But 1,600 miles away, in the panhandle of Texas, a life was being meticulously archived. An attorney's office sat silent. A basketball goal for a little girl's birthday remained unbought, and a red Chevrolet Camaro sat abandoned at a courthouse. Tonight, we unravel the most logistically impossible mystery in the annals of American missing persons. How did a respected Texas attorney vanish from his living room on a Sunday evening only to be killed on a Washington highway 28 hours later? This is the anatomy of a journey that should not have been possible. This is the case of David Glenn Lewis. To understand the end of David Lewis, we have to understand the man he was in Amarillo. David wasn't just an attorney. He was a pillar, a former judge, a Sunday school teacher, and a devoted father to his daughter, Lauren. But the legal profession is a pressure cooker. By late 1992, the poker face David had spent years perfecting was beginning to show tiny, invisible cracks. David was facing a malpractice suit. In the world of law, your reputation is your currency. For a man who had sat on the bench, being the one accused of professional negligence was a heavy blow. Friends noted he was quieter than usual. He had recently lost an election for a district court seat, a public rejection that stung more than he let on. Did the pressure create a fugue, or was David being targeted by the very people he had once presided over? In the days leading up to January 1993, David began behaving with a strange, quiet urgency. January 31st, 1993, Super Bowl Sunday. For the Lewis household, it started as a normal day. His wife, Karen, and daughter, Lauren, were away on a trip to Dallas. David was home alone. We know David was there at 5 p.m. We know this because he did something incredibly mundane. He started the VCR. He manually set it to record the game. He made sandwiches. He did a load of laundry. These are the actions of a man who expects to be home in 3 hours. These are not the actions of a man planning to flee 1,600 miles across the country. But when Karen and Lauren returned at 8 p.m., the house was a ghost of itself. The VCR was humming, recording a game no one was watching. The sandwiches were untouched. David was gone, and most importantly, so was his red Chevrolet Camaro. The investigation began with a startling find. David's car wasn't missing for long. It was found parked at the Potter County Courthouse. Inside the car was David's wedding ring, his watch, and his wallet, containing his driver's license and credit cards. David had stripped himself of his identity. He had left behind every tool a person needs to travel in modern America. No ID, no money, no car. He was a ghost in the system. And yet, 1,600 miles away, the clock was already ticking toward his death. Let's look at the math. This is where the David Lewis case defies logic. If David drove, he would have had to average 60 miles per hour without stopping for gas, sleep, or food for 27 consecutive hours. But his car was in Amarillo. He couldn't have driven himself. To get from Amarillo to Yakima, in under 28 hours, David would have had to secure a flight. Remember, this was 1993. You didn't need a photo ID for a domestic flight, but you did need a ticket. David's credit cards were in his car. This means he had to pay cash. Where did the cash come from? Just days before, a mysterious $5,000 deposit appeared in his account. Was this travel money? Or was it something more sinister, a payoff? Even if he flew, the logistics are a nightmare. There are no direct flights. He would have had to navigate Dallas, Fort Worth, Seattle, and then a 150-mile trek from the airport to the specific stretch of Highway 24 where he was killed. And then there is the sighting that changes everything. Monday morning, February 1st. A cab driver in Dallas, 360 miles from Amarillo, claims he picked up a man matching David's description. The man was nervous. He had a wad of $100 bills. He wanted a ride to the airport. If that was David, he was still in Texas on Monday morning. He would have had less than 12 hours to reach a remote highway in Washington state. How does a man without a car, without a license, and under immense psychological stress pull off a feat of travel that would challenge a professional travel agent? Something happened in those 28 hours. Something that science wouldn't be able to answer for another 11 years. For the next 11 years, the man killed on Highway 24 was a phantom. To the Yakima County Sheriff's Office, he was simply case number 9, 3-0-1525, a John Doe buried in a pauper's grave, miles from anyone who knew his name. But the evidence found on his body told a story that defied every law of logic. When David Glenn Lewis left his house in Amarillo, he was wearing a cotton sweatsuit and tennis shoes, the universal uniform of a man relaxing on a Sunday evening. But when his body was processed in Washington, the inventory list read like something out of a military surplus catalog. He was dressed in full military camouflage, BDU fatigues, and heavy, steel-toed work boots. Where did this gear come from? His wife, Karen, was adamant. David didn't own a stitch of camouflage. He wasn't a hunter. He wasn't a survivalist. He was a man of the indoors, of law libraries and classrooms. Did he stop at a surplus store during a fugue state? Or was he dressed by someone else? The choice of clothing was especially chilling given the geographic context. He was killed just outside the perimeter of the Yakima Training Center. This is a massive, 300,000-acre tactical range. Locals call it Yakistan because the high desert terrain, bitterly cold, windswept, and barren, is a topographical twin to the mountains of Afghanistan. Was someone trying to make David look like a soldier who had gone AWOL? Or was he being hidden in plain sight? In an area crawling with men in fatigues, a man in camo is invisible. But on a public highway at 10:30 at night, that same camo becomes a death sentence. Then, there were the glasses. David's eyesight was notoriously poor. His friends and family said he was virtually helpless without his thick, distinctive spectacles. Yet, as he walked down the center of that pitch-black highway, his glasses weren't perched on his nose to help him see the oncoming danger. They were tucked neatly, almost carefully, into his jacket pocket. Think about the physical reality of that moment. A man who is legally blind without his eyewear is navigating the white line of a high-speed road in total darkness. He wouldn't have seen the car coming until the headlights were a blur of white light inches from his face. This wasn't the behavior of a man trying to get somewhere. It was the behavior of someone profoundly disoriented, or perhaps someone who had been placed there, stripped of his vision, and told to walk. For over a decade, the case remained frozen in two separate worlds. In Texas, the file on David Lewis was gathering dust. The Amarillo police had written him off as a voluntary missing, another man who had simply buckled under the pressure of the law and walked away. In Washington, the Moxie, John Doe, was just another cold case, a nameless victim of a hit-and-run driver who had vanished into the night. That changed in early 2003, thanks to a detective named Pat Ditter. Ditter was a man who hated the void of unidentified remains. He had recently read a series of scathing articles about how law enforcement agencies were failing to share information across state lines. He realized that the answer to his John Doe could be sitting in a folder 2,000 miles away, and he'd never know it. Ditter decided to try something that in 2003 was considered fringe detective work. He sat down at a computer, opened a web browser, and used a new search engine called Google. He typed in a basic profile: white male, late 30s, blue eyes, missing since early 1993. Within a week, he hit the Doe Network website. He saw the face of David Glenn Lewis, the jawline, the height, the weight, everything lined up. But it was the detail in the personal effects section that made Ditter's blood run cold. The missing attorney from Texas was famous for his thick, heavy glasses. Ditter hurried to the evidence locker. He pulled out the glasses found in the dead man's pocket 11 years earlier. He held them up to the photo on the screen. It was a perfect, unmistakable match. In October of 2004, the final hammer blow of truth arrived. A DNA test from the University of North Texas confirmed the impossible. The Moxie John Doe was indeed David Glenn Lewis. The identification ended the mystery of who died, but it cracked open a far more terrifying question. Because DNA can tell you a name, but it can't explain why a man who was recording the Super Bowl on a Sunday night in Texas ended up dead in military fatigues on a Washington highway 28 hours later. As the investigators in Texas reopened the file, they realized they weren't looking at a missing person anymore. They were looking at a map of a shadow. To understand why David Lewis ended up on that road, we have to look at the life he left behind. In the eyes of his neighbors, David was the definition of stable. But in the months leading up to his disappearance, his professional world was becoming a minefield. David had recently lost his seat as a judge, and his private practice was struggling to find its footing. But the real weight, the monster in the room, was a massive malpractice lawsuit. For a man who lived by the law, being accused of failing it was a source of profound, hidden shame. In the close-knit legal community of Amarillo, reputation isn't just a social asset, it's your livelihood. Investigators began to look at David's final days with a magnifying glass, and they found a series of financial anomalies that suggested a man either preparing for a final exit or being manipulated by someone with deep pockets. The most glaring detail was the $5,000 deposit. Just days before he vanished, $5,000 in cash appeared in David's bank account. This wasn't a bank transfer, it was a physical deposit of bills. In 1993, that was a significant sum, the equivalent of over $10,000 today. Was it a hush money payment? Was it a retainer for a dangerous client who insisted on staying off the books? Or was David liquidating his life, bit by bit, for a journey he knew he couldn't survive? Then there were the plane tickets. When police searched for travel records, they found something that made their heads spin. A series of tickets had been purchased in David's name for flights all over the country, locations he had no reason to visit. Some of these flights were scheduled for times when David was demonstrably still in Amarillo. This suggests one of two things. Either David was intentionally creating a smoke screen to throw people off his trail, or someone else was using his name to move through the skies, creating a digital ghost of David Lewis while the real man was being transported elsewhere. It is a hallmark of professional interference, creating a paper trail that points in every direction except the truth. This leads us to the most debated theory in the case: the targeted hit. Think about the geography of the crime. If you want to eliminate a high-profile attorney or a former judge, doing it in their hometown is a risk. The local police will move heaven and earth to find the killer. But if that same man dies 1,600 miles away in a random hit and run on a dark highway, the investigation dies with him. In this scenario, David didn't choose Washington. Washington was chosen for him. The theory suggests that David may have been abducted from his home on that Sunday evening. Perhaps he was lured out to the courthouse under the guise of a late-night legal emergency, which would explain why his car was found there, parked neatly with his wedding ring and watch left inside. From there, he could have been forced into another vehicle or onto a private plane. But why the military camouflage? And why the Yakima Training Center? Some theorists believe David was being held at a safe house or a remote location near the military base. The camo wasn't a fashion choice, it was a psychological tactic. It stripped David of his identity as a civilian professional and turned him into a non-person. Just another anonymous figure in a high-security military zone. If he was being held against his will, dressing him in fatigues ensured that anyone who saw him from a distance would assume he was just another soldier on maneuvers. If David had escaped his captors that night, his first instinct would have been to run toward the road, desperate for a passing motorist. Disoriented, without his glasses, and perhaps drugged with a substance that wouldn't show up on a standard toxicology screen, he would have been a sitting duck on Highway 24. The toxicology report at the time was negative, but as many forensic experts point out, 1993 screens were far less sophisticated than they are today. Many fast-acting sedatives or hallucinogens would have been long gone by the time the John Doe was autopsied. But if it was a hit, who held the grudge? David had presided over hundreds of cases. He had sent people to prison. He had ruled against powerful interests. In the legal world, every decision you make creates an enemy. Was David Lewis killed because of a secret he was keeping? Or was he killed because of a secret he was about to tell? We have to ask, was the malpractice suit a distraction? Or was it the motive? If David was about to be deposed, he might have been ready to reveal information that threatened someone even more powerful than himself. In the high-stakes world of Texas law and politics, a dead man tells no tales, and a dead man 1,600 miles from home isn't even a story. While the theory of a professional hit is chilling, we have to look at the evidence that suggests David might have been moving of his own accord, however irrational those movements seemed. This brings us to the sighting that turns the entire timeline into a mathematical nightmare. On Monday morning, February 1st, just hours after David vanished from his home, a cab driver in Dallas made a report that would haunt the investigation for decades. He claimed he picked up a man at a hotel who was the spitting image of David Glenn Lewis. The man was sweating. He was visibly agitated, and he was carrying a thick wad of $100 bills. He didn't want a long tour of the city. He wanted to go directly to the airport. If this man was David, it answers one question while posing 10 more. Dallas is 360 miles from Amarillo. For David to be there by Monday morning, he would have had to drive through the night, but his car was already sitting at the courthouse in his hometown. This means someone else drove him, or he took a bus or a cab under a different name. More importantly, if David was in Dallas on Monday morning, he had less than 12 hours to reach Moxie, Washington. To make that happen, he would have had to board a flight, navigate a connection, and somehow find his way to a remote desert highway by 10:30 that night. In 1993, the logistics of such a trip, without a credit card or a driver's license, are nearly impossible. Yet the cab driver was certain. He saw a man who looked like David, acting like a man who was running for his life. This leads some investigators to a darker possibility. Was David living a double life? It is a theory that his family finds insulting, but in true crime, we have to look at the patterns. The $5,000 deposit, the mysterious plane tickets to cities he had no connection to, the sudden appearance of military clothing. To a stranger, this looks like a man who had been building a shadow identity for months. Could David have been involved in something outside the law? Perhaps a side of his legal practice that involved high-risk clients or offshore accounts? If David was living a double life, Washington might not have been a random destination. It might have been his extraction point, but the double life theory falls apart the moment you look at the man himself. David was a creature of habit. He was a Sunday school teacher who loved his daughter more than anything in the world. He was looking forward to her birthday. He was recording the Super Bowl. Men who are planning to vanish don't usually start the VCR and make sandwiches for a game they never intend to watch. This brings us to the fugue state theory. Psychiatrists describe a dissociative fugue as a rare condition where a person suddenly loses their sense of identity and impulsively wanders far from home, often triggered by extreme stress, like a looming malpractice suit. A person in a fugue state might board a plane, buy strange clothes, and end up in a city they've never visited, with no memory of how they got there. If David was in a fugue, it would explain the lack of his glasses. In a state of mental collapse, he might have tucked them away, wandering into the dark highway, not because he wanted to die, but because he no longer knew who he was or how the world worked. It would be a tragedy of the mind, a man lost within himself, traveling thousands of miles just to find an end he didn't understand. But even a fugue state doesn't explain the camouflage. It doesn't explain where he got the boots. And it doesn't explain how a man with no ID managed to talk his way onto a plane in Dallas. As we look at the final hours of David Glenn Lewis, we are forced to choose between two impossible realities. Either David was the victim of a conspiracy so perfect it spanned half the continent, or he was a man whose mind broke so completely that he performed a miracle of travel just to die in the dirt of a desert he didn't know. However, there is one final piece of evidence that has never been fully explained. A witness on that Washington highway didn't just see a man. They saw a vehicle, a flash of red in the darkness that matches a car from David's past, but wasn't the one he left at the courthouse. As we draw the final curtain on this impossible journey, we are forced to look at the one piece of evidence that could turn this from a tragic accident into a calculated execution. A witness on that Washington highway, a driver who passed by just minutes before the collision, reported seeing more than just a man walking in the dark. They reported seeing a vehicle, specifically a red Chevrolet Camaro. Wait, we know David's Camaro was found at the Potter County Courthouse in Amarillo. The police verified it. The keys were gone, but the car was there. So how could a matching car be on Highway 24 in Moxie at the exact moment of David's death? Was it a glitch in the witness's memory? Or was it the ultimate signature of a professional hit? If someone wanted to frame David's death as a random accident, what better way to do it than using a car identical to his own, as if mocking the man they were about to destroy? This leads us to the most disturbing question of all. If David didn't drive himself to Washington, who was behind the wheel of that red car? In 2004, when the DNA results finally gave David his name back, the world expected a murder investigation to begin, but it never did. The Washington State Patrol maintained that the death was a hit and run, and because the driver was never found, the case was effectively closed. The Amarillo police, despite the bizarre logistics, never reopened the case as a homicide. To the authorities, David Glenn Lewis was simply a man who had an accident in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for Karen and Lauren Lewis, there is no such thing as case closed. They are left with a legacy of questions that defy the laws of physics. How does a man with no ID, no credit cards, and no car travel 1,600 miles in 28 hours? How does an attorney who spent his life in suits and ties end up in military fatigues and work boots? The David Lewis case is a reminder that the world is much larger and much darker than the grid of a city map or the logic of a legal brief. It is a story of a man who vanished into the missing time. The 28 hours where David Lewis ceased to be an attorney and became a phantom. Some believe David was a victim of a deep state conspiracy, a man who knew too much about the wrong people in the Texas legal system. Others believe he was a man who succumbed to a silent, private war within his own mind. A fugue state so powerful, it drove him across the continent to a desert he had never seen. But perhaps the truth lies in the most terrifying possibility of all, that you can do everything right. You can be a good father, a fair judge, and a loyal friend, and still be snatched away by a shadow you never saw coming. Now, we want to hear from you. Cases like this only stay alive when people refuse to let them fade into the archives. Do you believe David Lewis was a victim of a professional hit? Or was this a tragic mental breakdown that defied the odds of travel? Tell us your theory in the comments below. Your perspective might be the one that connects a detail everyone else has missed. If you found this deep dive compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. By sharing this video, you help keep David's story in the public eye. ensuring that even 30 years later, we are still searching for the truth. David's body was eventually returned to Texas. He was buried near the home he never intended to leave. But the man who was killed in Moxie remains a mystery that refuses to rest. If you were in Yakima County in February of 1993, if you saw a red car speeding away from Highway 24, or if you know how a man from Texas could travel half the country without an ID, the truth is still out there. Because in the anatomy of a vanishing, the only thing more permanent than death is the silence of the people who know what happened. Thank you for watching. David Lewis deserved better than a dark highway. He deserved the truth.